Here's the overview of the first midterm study guide. I'll start with question 1. This is from chapter 1. So I ask you, what is social constructionism? And I ask you to explain how it helps us understand how social problems can change over time and place. And social constructionism is something that is a term sociologists use quite a bit. So do political scientists as well. It's that idea that society constructs meanings for the world around us. And so there's a discussion in the text about social constructionism. That is, how do we think about social problems? So how does social constructionism help us to understand how social problems change over time? I ask you to give 2 examples. You'll want to be thinking about ways in which something, let's say, well, it hasn't changed completely, but same-sex marriage. There was social construction of the social constructionism of same-sex marriage was such that people believed it was bad, evil, and wrong, immoral, etc. And over time that has changed finally, slowly of course, but by 2015 the U.S. Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges said no, all states must recognize same-sex marriage. So by thinking about how society constructs ideas about good and bad, right and wrong, that helps us to understand how something such as same-sex marriage, which for probably about 2,000 years was thought to be bad, evil, and wrong, at least in the United States, began to be considered to be something that was a right, the right to marry who you want to. Examine the concepts of the sociological eye and the sociological imagination. Remember that the sociological eye is being able to see what others might not see, really being open to observing all that's around you, not just the things that you're used to, and then using that sociological imagination to try to understand how social institutions, how a person's history, and even sometimes how that person's biology or ancestry might affect their experiences in the United States. Explain the differences between these concepts and describe how they are connected. And I just explained how they are connected. Read the article about parenting discussed in the chapter, and then here's a link to the little box that's in the text called Some Parents Are Letting Grow. And so here's the link to the article that talks more in detail about that growing concept or growing movement, I guess I might say. I don't know if it's so much a movement, but the increasing numbers of parents that are choosing this style of parenting. So I ask you to discuss what you think about the let grow concept and explain why, and support your answer with at least 2 examples. And again, it's always a good idea to study and make sure that you've read that article prior to beginning the test, because you're not going to have enough time to both read the article and answer the rest of the class, or the question, should you be assigned this one. Question 2 comes from chapter 2. I ask you here to explain social reproduction theory and explain the 5 factors that are considered. And I tell you where to look for this. Discuss the Davis-Moore hypothesis, explain the 4 factors that are considered, which is on the following page there. Based upon your own analysis of the situation in the United States, explain which theory you think best explains economic inequality in the U.S. Okay, so after you explain these 2 theories, move through the 4 factors, made your own, and given an example, then I want you to think about what you see. Do you think Davis-Moore hypothesis better explains what we see in the United States, or do you think it's more social reproduction theory that better explains what's happening in the U.S., where we are now, at this point in time? Examine how racism, sexism, and unequal access to educational opportunities have contributed to the increased economic inequality in the U.S. Make sure to support your statements with examples. And again, you should talk about those three things: racism, sexism, and unequal access. How those three things contributed. So make sure you're talking about each one separately and how they contribute to educational unequal access to educational opportunities. Question 3 is from Chapter 3. Describe how the process of racialization affects both whites and people of color. Remember that racialization is how we think about certain races, and we think negatively perhaps about some races and positively about another. And so if you are a person of color, obviously tends to be a negative effect when you are racialized, because all of those negative ideas and racial epithets, etc., are out there in society, and without being aware of them, people may be interacting with a person of color based upon what's already in their heads and their biases. On the other hand, if you are Caucasian or white, then you probably have a much better experience in the United States and probably around the world, because white has been normalized. Being white has been normalized. And so people aren't afraid of you. People don't shun you because of how you look. And so you have a very different experience than someone of color. Provide examples to support your discussion. Analyze how voter suppression and discrimination in employment contribute to racial inequality. And there's a really good discussion in the text about these two things, so make sure you review that. If you could choose only one of the following, which would it be and why? Also discuss how you would use the type of capital you choose. So the three types of capital discussed in the chapter are economic capital, social capital, and cultural capital. And so I'm asking you to choose just one, because you could only have one in this hypothetical. Which one would you choose, and why would you choose it? And then explain how you would use it. Like what would you do with that type of social capital? Give me at least a couple of examples there. Question number 4 is from Chapter 4, and I ask you to define a patriarchal culture and explain the three components. And I point you to the page there. Using these three components, analyze American society and explain whether you believe that the U.S. is a patriarchal society. Make sure to support your analysis with examples. Explain how occupational segregation, employer preference, and discrimination, and the glass ceiling contribute to the gender wage gap. So it's three things there: occupational segregation, second thing is employer preference, third thing is discrimination. And so you're going to explain how each one of those contribute to the gender wage gap, and pretty good discussion in the text there as well. Provide examples to support your discussion. The last question is question 5. Here I ask you to discuss the history of anti-sodomy laws, or I think it's a misnomer, but they call them sodomy laws. Anti-sodomy laws is more correct, because these were laws against people having sodomy or anal sex. Be sure to include the historical reasons for why these laws were enacted, and I think there's a fairly good overview of these laws when they were enacted by different societies and the reasons why those societies said they were enacting them. Explain the current global stance regarding sodomy. So globally, how does the U.S. compare to those other countries? What does it look like in other countries? And discuss the difference between sex work and sex trafficking, because there is a difference. Finally, in your opinion, should the U.S. legalize prostitution? So there's a discussion in the text about what some proponents of legalization argue are positive things. And of course, there's a discussion of the things that opponents argue would be negative, would be huge downsides to legalizing prostitution. So support your opinion with examples. So that's it. I would say good luck, but you don't need luck. You're just going to study.